Greetings, Shabbat Shalom. Many years ago, I was at my home in Pasadena, California, near the border of Pasadena and South Pasadena. It was summer. Classes were not in session. And so I wasn't in the office, which I normally would be that time of day. It was late morning during the week. But I happened to be at home. I got a phone call, and it was from the pastor general of the church. Here I am at home, late morning, and I get a call from the pastor general of the church. And he politely asked me, could I come to his office? Well, I reacted the same way any of you would. Sir, classes are not in session. I'm home with my family. How dare you disturb me? Not. Right? I said right away, yes, sir, I'll come right over. Then as I put down the phone, I thought to myself, why did he call? Why does he want me to come? He didn't tell me. I didn't ask him. I thought if he wants to talk to me, probably it has to be about the Hebrew Bible. So I took my Tanakh and off I went. And sure enough, when I got to his spacious office, there were a large number of VIPs there, church VIPs. Who's who of the headquarters staff. And at that time, the pastor general asked me to explain Zechariah 12 and verse 8. Well, I'm going to ask you as a homework assignment to go ahead and read from Zechariah 12:1 through verse 8 and into verse 9. So you can do that as a homework assignment. Today, I want to cover the end of that chapter, verses 10 through verse 14. I want to talk about a reconciliation of revolutionary repercussions. Now, last week, I spoke about the organization of the Hebrew Bible. Josephus talks about putting the material being organized into 22 books. And I wanted to cover that a little bit. There are 22 specific symbols of the Hebrew alphabet. So it makes sense that the Hebrew and Aramaic scriptures would be in 22 books. Also, Jacob was the 22nd generation, and he is the father of the Old Testament church. They are Bnei Yaakov, Bnei Israel. They're the children of Israel. He's the 22nd generation from Adam. Now, the Jews today divide up the books 24 ways. What they do is they divide Joshua and Judges, and they divide Samuel and Kings. But, if you think about it, Joshua and Judges is really one book talking about Israel before the monarchy. And 1st and 2nd, 3rd and 4th Kings, which is one way to talk about it, that whole book, long book, is about Israel under the monarchy. Now, way back in 1965, I was a sophomore at Yeshiva University. And here is a textbook that I used. I hope you can see this. This textbook says Sefer, the book, and then it says Yehoshua Shoftim, Joshua Judges. It's in one book. So it's interesting that they organized it that way for my textbook. It has the word Sefer, book, and then it has Joshua Judges, Yehoshua Shoftim. So anyway, that makes it helps make my case. So we have 22 books in the Old Testament in 3 parts, as you know: Law, Prophets, and Writings. Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, or Tanakh. And that's the tripartite division of the Old Testament. And the way the books are organized, it finishes with a summary of Old Testament history in the book of Chronicles. Now, I quoted last week from Luke 24 and verse 44. Jesus Christ is explaining to these two men how the Bible prophesies about him. Luke 24:44. And he said to them, "These are the words which I spoke to you while I was still with you, that all things must be fulfilled which were written in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms concerning me." Now, the Psalms in most Hebrew Bibles is the first section of that first book of that third section, the Hagiographa, the Holy Writings. In Greek, they're called Hagiographa. In Hebrew, they're called Ketuvim, the writings. And the Psalms is a substantial part of that, and the first part. So it may be Luke 24:44 is a hint that the material could be organized that way, the way the Hebrew-speaking world organizes the Old Testament into the Tanakh. Now, if you add, let me say this. I talked about 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet. There are 5 letters that have a special form, final form, when they're at the end of a word, the very last letter of a word. And so that makes 27 symbols. And the Bible finishes with 27 books. The New Testament. Now, the New Testament is written in Greek. The Greek alphabet has 24 letters, but one of them has a special form when it's at the end of a word. Plus, there are 2 other symbols that were used in the numerical system of ancient Greece. So that gives us 27 symbols, and we have 27 books in the New Testament. And as I mentioned, we have law, prophets, and writings. And then in the New Testament, we have the New Testament Pentateuch, Gospels and Acts, Luke being the author of Luke and Acts. Then we have the Pauline epistles, 14 of them, including Hebrews, whether or not Paul wrote them, but they're really part of that section. And then we have general epistles, 7 books. Then we have Revelation. So we have altogether 49 books, 7 times 7, in 7 parts. And I think this is a review from last week. But I want to show you that an Orthodox Jew, if he were, like say the Apostle Paul, if he were alive today, if he's reading the Bible, his last book is 2 Chronicles. I want to show you how that ties in with Matthew, the beginning of the Gospels. So let's go to Chronicles, and let's go to the beginning of Chronicles. And so it's the way your Bibles are organized is law, history, poetry, prophecy. So I'm going to the historical section. All right. And so in 1 Chronicles, we see genealogies, beginning with Adam, Seth, Enosh, and it keeps going, right? When you come to the 3rd chapter, it begins to focus on the Davidic line, which is so important at the end of the Old Testament. This is 2 Chronicles 3:1. Now these were the sons of David who were born to him in Hebron, and it talks about that. So you'll find here Levi and David and Judah emphasized because God is working in Jerusalem and God is working through the Levitical priesthood and the Davidic monarchs. And this is a preparation for the New Testament where you have John the Baptist, the priest, leading the way, and then Jesus Christ of the Davidic line, the Messiah, comes. So I just showed you how Chronicles begins with genealogies, particularly focusing on David. Now, if you go to the book of Matthew, and Matthew 1, how does it begin? The same way. Genealogies focusing, it begins with or goes to Abraham, and then, but eventually it jumps on to the Davidic line. The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. So you see it, if you're reading Chronicles, it just ties right in. You continue right on with the flow. And let's go now to the end of the 2 Chronicles, the end of the book of Chronicles. The Old Testament concludes here with the opportunity for the Jews to return to their homeland and to rebuild their temple. And you have Cyrus, who's called a shepherd. He's a type of Jesus Christ. He conquers the Babylonian Empire and restores the Jews. He's a type of Jesus Christ. And look how the Old Testament concludes in 2 Chronicles. So if, let's say, you're an Orthodox Jew reading the Tanakh, and then you discover the New Testament. Here's how it goes. Verse 23 of 2 Chronicles 36. Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, all the kingdoms of the earth the eternal God of heaven has given me, and he has commanded me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Who is among you? Of all his people, may the eternal his God be with him, and let him go up. The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ. See? Ties right in. That's Matthew 1. The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Now, if you're an Orthodox Jew reading through the Old Testament, you come to 2 Chronicles, you come to a final martyr. Now, the first martyr is Abel, right? Righteous Abel. He's martyred. Then we have another righteous martyr as you come to the end of the Old Testament in 2 Chronicles 24. I go to verse 20. Verse 20 of 2 Chronicles 24. Verse 20. Then the Spirit of God came upon Zechariah the son of Jehoiada, the priest, who stood above the people, and said to them, Thus says God, why do you transgress the commandments of the Eternal, so that you cannot prosper? Because you have forsaken the Eternal, he has also forsaken you. Now Jehoiada, the high priest, had protected Joash, had restored him to his proper throne, and now his son, the son of Jehoiada, is trying to correct Joash, who'd apostatized. So instead of appreciating it and appreciating the kindness of the family, Joash has him killed. So they conspired against him, verse 21, and at the command of the king, they stoned him with stones in the court of the house of the Eternal. Isn't that a dastardly thing? Horrible. A martyrdom of this prophet. Then Joash the king did not remember the kindness which Jehoiada his father had done to him, but killed his son. And as he died, he said, The Eternal look on and repay. Which happened. This martyrdom was punished. So what happened in the spring of the year that the army of Syria came up against him, and they came to Judah and Jerusalem and destroyed all the leaders of the people from among the people and sent all their spoil to the king of Damascus. Let's go to verse 24. For the army of the Syrians came with a small company of men, but the Eternal delivered a very great army into their hand, because they had forsaken the Eternal God of their fathers. So they executed judgment against Joash. And he died ignominiously, as we'll see, buried with less than the proper honors. Verse 25. And when they had withdrawn from him, for they had left him severely wounded, his own servants conspired against him because of the blood of the sons of Jehoiada the priest, and killed him on his bed. So he died. And they buried him in the city of David, but they did not bury him in the tombs of the kings. So we have this final martyrdom and punishment. And when we go to Matthew, we find Jesus Christ in Matthew 23 summarizing the history of martyrdom in the Old Testament in Matthew 23, verse 35. Condemning the scribes and Pharisees. And remember, a generation later, Jerusalem was going to be devastated. That on you, this is Matthew 23:35, that on you may come all the righteous blood shed on the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Assuredly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. So he summarized the Bible from Genesis through Chronicles. Now, this is a problematic passage because the Zechariah martyred in Chronicles is called the son of Jehoiada. However, it could very well be that Jehoiada had two names. Jehoiada means the Eternal has known, the Eternal knew, and Berechiah means blessed is the Eternal. So perhaps his family could have named him, the Eternal knew that we wanted a son, he's given us a son, blessed is the Eternal. So it could very well be that he had the name Jehoiada and Berechiah. Could very well be. And in that case, as many scholars believe, that this is in effect summarizing the Old Testament from Abel to Zechariah. So again, you see the connection between the end of the Old Testament, the way the Jews organized the material, and the New Testament. And Matthew, as you know, was addressed originally to a Jewish audience. Now, if you go to the book of Luke, you find that unfortunately, well, first let's go to John 12, that when Jesus came into Jerusalem initially, that final Passover season, he was greeted with great joy and very positively as the Messiah. But when he allowed himself to be arrested, they turned on him. It's interesting, the fickleness of crowds, but you know that if you study history. I'm going to John 12 and verse 12 of John. The next day a great multitude that had come to the feast, when they had heard that Jesus was coming to Jerusalem, took branches of palm trees like they would do at the Feast of Tabernacles. This is at the spring festival, and went out to meet him and cried, Hosanna, quoting Psalm 118, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Eternal. In Psalm 118, verse 26, it says, Baruch haba b'shem Adonai. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Eternal, the King of Israel. So you see the kind of greeting he got. But then you see what happened later. Oh, no, they wanted Barabbas and not Jesus. And their leaders stirred them up, and they wanted Jesus executed. It's terrible. But let's go. So generally speaking, the Jewish community rejected him. Now, many didn't. But unfortunately, the leadership did, and many did. And generally speaking, there's been a hostility between the Jewish community and Jesus Christ to this day. Now, of course, a lot of that has to do with the persecution that they've received at the hands of the Christian world. And they tend to blame, in a way, they tend to blame Jesus for that. I want to go to Luke 23. And we see that Pilate had released to them Barabbas. In verse 20, this is Luke 23:20. Pilate, therefore, wishing to release Jesus, called out to them, but they shouted, saying, Crucify him, crucify him. Isn't that terrible? They had been so positive initially, but not now. Then he said to them the third time, Why, what evil has he done? I have found no reason for death in him. I will therefore chastise him and let him go. But they were insistent, demanding with loud voices that he be crucified, and the voices of these men and the chief priests prevailed. So Pilate gave sentence that it should be as they requested. But there were those who were mourning for him. You know that, of course, Joseph of Arimathea was a follower, and we see here in Luke 23 in verse 27, and a great multitude of the people followed him as he was going to Golgotha, or Calvary in the Latin. And a great multitude of the people followed him, and women who also mourned and lamented him. And you can read on what he said, what he told them. So there were women who were mourning and lamenting. So there was, in that sense, a mixed reaction. But overall, the crowd had said, crucify him. The leaders had stirred them up. And generally speaking, the Jewish community, did not accept his teachings and the apostolic teachings. And the New Testament is not part of their Bible. If you go to Revelation, when it speaks of the second coming of Christ, Revelation 1 and verse 8. Revelation 1 verse 8. I'm sorry, I want to go to verse 7. Behold, he is coming with clouds, and every eye will see him, even they who pierced him. And all the tribes of the earth will mourn because of him. Even so, amen. Well, really, all of us are guilty of the death of Jesus Christ. The Romans executed him, and many Jews cried out, crucify him. And someday they'll be resurrected and have to confront him. But in a poetic sense, the people of Judah today, who have that hostility to him and have that background that their ancestors in many cases called out, crucify him, they're going to look upon him who in a sense whom they pierced in the sense of their ancestors. Behold, he is coming with clouds, and every eye will see him, even they who pierced him. But this time around, they're going to greet him as they greeted him before his arrest, in a very positive way. He's going to deliver them. There's going to be a final war taking place in Jerusalem, an occupation and war, and the Jews are going to look to God for deliverance, looking for their Messiah, and the Messiah is going to come, and they're going to realize that Messiah who is coming was in fact the one who was crucified 2 millennia before. I want to go to John 4 and verse 22. The conversion of the Jews is then going to be a very positive step in God's plan to save humankind. John 4 and verse 22. Here he says to the Samaritan woman, Jesus says to her, You worship what you do not know. We know what we worship, for salvation is of the Jews. And John says in the first chapter, verse 11, he came to his own. Now, there's various ways you can understand that, but one way you can understand it is that Jesus, coming as a descendant of David, a Jew, came to his own. But unfortunately, a majority of them didn't receive him. Some did, and they became the early church. But unfortunately, a majority did not, and the church eventually came to be generally a Gentile church. I go to John 1:11. He came to his own, and his own did not receive him. But as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become children of God, to those who believe in his name. And you know how Jesus Christ is identified. We go to Revelation 5 and verse 5. In Revelation 5 and verse 5, but one of the elders said to me, "Do not weep. Behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the root of David, has prevailed to open the scroll and to loose its 7 seals." So here is Jesus Christ, the Lion of Judah, and he's going to return as the Lion of Judah to liberate his people, to give them victory, but also to reconcile them to him. There's going to be a mass conversion, and I'm going to talk more about that in just a moment. If you look at Jeremiah, the 11th chapter, here we see Israel compared to an olive tree. Now, there's a lot I could say about that, but I'll just read a verse or so out of Jeremiah 11. And of course, the focus here, he was in Judah, but Israel had already sinned and been taken into captivity, and now the Jews, it was their turn to be punished for their sins. I'm going to Jeremiah 11:16. The Eternal called your name green olive tree, lovely and of good fruit. With the noise of a great tumult, he has kindled fire on it, and its branches are broken. He's breaking branches off of the olive tree. This is verse 17. For the Eternal of hosts who planted you has pronounced doom against you for the evil of the house of Israel and of the house of Judah, which they have done against themselves to provoke me to anger in offering incense to Baal, or we say in America, Baal. So Israel is compared to an olive tree, and as we know, the northern kingdom has disappeared historically. When you come to the time of the Apostle Paul, the Jews are the church. And here's what Paul says about his people, for whom he had great devotion. He's talking about how he is the apostle to the Gentiles, and the Gentiles, in effect, have, to a certain way, not fully, I don't believe in replacement theology, as some call it, but what has happened is that the Jews remain in God's plan, but they are not now functioning as God's church. Rather, his church is a new covenant church, converted people, and they are from all ethnic groups. And right now, the church has a very large Gentile component, and they have in effect replaced Judah, because Judah didn't follow Christ. So as we know, the gospel went to the Greeks. They preserved the New Testament. The Jews don't have the New Testament. So in that sense, there is a spiritual Judah, Romans 2:28-29. There's a spiritual Israel, Galatians 6:16. There's a spiritual Israel, spiritual Judah. But God isn't through with that nation, and he does intend ultimately to convert the world through that nation. And I want to go to Romans 11 and verse 19. Paul, speaking to the Gentiles, says, You will say then, branches were broken off that I might be grafted in. Okay, so the olive tree had branches broken off, and so now God is grafting in these Gentiles. So now they become spiritually Israel, spiritually Judah. But then look what he says in verse 24. If these Gentiles can become part of the tree, how much more can Judah become part of the tree when finally their minds are open, as was the mind of the Apostle Paul? I'm now in verse 24. For if you were cut out of the olive tree, which is wild by nature, and were grafted contrary to nature into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these who are natural branches be grafted into their own olive tree? So obviously, once their minds are open, when we have these Orthodox Jews in the end time reconciled to Jesus Christ, when suddenly everything fits together, we're going to have all thousands of Apostle Pauls turn loose on the world. It's going to lead to a mass conversion of people when these eloquent Jews steeped in the Scriptures, and now having the New Testament to sort of to complete the picture, spiritually speaking. Now they can really be a very important factor in the conversion of humanity, as we see in Zechariah 8. Zechariah 8 in verse 23. I want to go to Zechariah 8 and verse 23. In those days, says the Eternal of Hosts, or let me start again. Thus says the Eternal of Hosts, in those days 10 men from every language of the nations shall grasp the sleeve of a Jewish man, saying, let us go with you, for we have heard that God is with you. And go back to Romans 11 and look what Paul has to say. He said, now, the Gentiles have benefited, since in effect, the Jews have, the Super Bowl is coming up. So let's say the Jews have fumbled the ball or passed the ball to the Gentiles, but eventually they're going to get the ball back and carry it over the goal line. You can use that analogy. Let's go to Romans 11 and verse 12. Paul says about the Jews and Gentiles, Romans 11:12. Now, if their fall is riches for the world, and their failure riches for the Gentiles, how much more their fullness? So once they come to that understanding, what a powerful impact that's going to have. As we see in Isaiah 11 and verse 9, the impact of the conversion of the Jews. Let's go to Isaiah 11 and verse 9 as we project into the millennium. They shall not hurt nor destroy in all my holy mountain, for the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Eternal, as the waters cover the sea. I do want to go now to Zechariah, the 12th chapter, which I said I was going to talk about today. And in Zechariah 12, we see that the Jews are in Jerusalem under siege. They're looking for deliverance, and their Messiah comes and delivers them. And then they realize this is the one who was crucified 2 millennia ago. And we have this reconciliation. Zechariah 12:10. And I will pour on the house of David and on the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and supplication. Then they will look on me whom they pierced. Yes, they will mourn for him as one mourns for his only son, and grieve for him as one grieves for a firstborn. In ancient times, Josiah, a righteous king, a descendant of David, died prematurely, and he was seriously mourned. You look at 2 Chronicles 35, you look at Lamentations 4. There was a serious grieving for Josiah, and the grieving for Jesus Christ will even be more intense. Verse 11. In that day there shall be a great mourning in Jerusalem, like the mourning of Hadad-Rimon in the plain of Megiddo. Verse 12. And the land shall mourn every family by itself, the family of the house of David by itself, and their wives by themselves. And now we have a branch of the family of David. The house of Nathan by itself, and their wives by themselves. The family of the house of Levi by itself, and their wives by themselves. And now we have a branch of the Levites. And the family of Shimei by itself, and their wives by themselves. When Jewish people pray, men pray separately from women. So this is going to be devout people who are going to be in a serious repentance and now the picture is all put together. Now the Old Testament makes the kind of sense that maybe it didn't fully make before. Now they really have the picture. Now they understand Exodus 12. Now they understand Genesis 22. Now they understand Isaiah 53, and so on and so on. And then we go to verse 14. All the families that remain, every family by itself, and their wives by themselves. So Judah becomes the first nation to be converted en masse. And as I said, you can just imagine when we have thousands of Apostle Pauls, spiritual warriors ready to teach humankind, the great blessing that will be. And what it will lead to, we find in Philippians, the 2nd chapter. If we go to Paul's letter to the church at Philippi, I want to go to the 2nd chapter and the 11th verse. The conversion of Judah will lead to this result. It will be like a spiritual nuclear explosion. Philippians 2 and verse 11. Now, I was moved to give this talk because this week we have had commemoration of the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. On Thursday, there was a commemorative meeting with many dignitaries from around the world attending in Jerusalem, commemorating the end of the Holocaust, as it were, the liberation of the Auschwitz death camp. And then on Monday will be the actual anniversary, and the United Nations has designated that day a Holocaust Memorial Day. So with people thinking about that at this time of year, I thought this would be an appropriate talk. The time is going to come when Jews who have been persecuted over the centuries, by the way, this is the month, this 10th month, which is almost over. This is the month in which Esther entered the house of King Ahasuerus, Ahasuerus, Xerxes. And so God gave the cure, as you know he does, before the disease. That is to say, before the threat of genocide came, Esther was on the scene, as we see in Esther 4:14, for such a time as this. So the Jews were saved. And in modern times, 1/3 of the Jewish community was destroyed, but the other 2/3 have gone on to a kind of renaissance, and from the ashes of the Holocaust has come the state of Israel, which in its region of the world is a superpower in that region. So anyway, it's interesting how history has gone in recent times, and how we're in effect preparing. History is heading towards that final climax, the second coming of Christ, and that's going to lead, as I said, to the mass conversion of the Jews. And then it's going to lead to the mass conversion of humanity. And so we see in Philippians 2 and verse 11, and that every tongue should confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. So if you look at the end of Zechariah 12, you see a reconciliation with revolutionary repercussions. All the best to you and yours.